Hey everybody, my name is Parsa, and I'm joined here today with my co-host TJ. We're recording from Saskatoon YMCA and are excited to present to you our very first United Platform podcast. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional homeland of the Métis. Reconciliation of our past is the first step to moving forward. And before we get started, let's talk about who we are and what we do. TJ?
We are both part of UP, the United Platform for Social Justice for the People of Saskatchewan. Now, UP is a network that unites various social justice organizations in order to build a stronger base of community services provided to the people of Saskatoon. By combining the multiple programs' efforts, we hope to significantly amplify the influence of their services in our community. Ultimately, we hope that the United Platform can provide a safe place for the organizations to come together, bringing their unique perspectives to create unison in our community. So, what are we doing here today, Parsa?
We're going to start this podcast with the goal of raising awareness about issues and events that are happening in our community. Through the podcast, we hope to encourage globally aware and well-rounded citizens so that we can all be more thoughtful and make decisions that not only benefit us but other people around us. We'll be introducing activist organizations that are doing their part to eliminate or reduce issues that are present locally.
On this installment of our podcast, we will be discussing the topic of racism. But before we dive in, I think it's very important for us to establish a clear definition of what racism really is, so we can better understand each other.
That's a great point. So what is racism? Racism is when prejudice, discriminations, or antagonism is directed against a person based on their membership in a particular ethnical or racial group, typically a group that is minority or marginalized.
So, what does this mean? Basically, some people will treat others around them differently because of the color of their skin, their appearance, their ethnic background, where they come from, and so on and so forth. In some cases, racism is nurtured or reinforced in people through parents or society.
And a lot of times it's very casual. People are taught to stay away from those people or given similar subtle hints about other racial groups. The influences people and choices and actions, and in severe cases leads to discrimination. It's always important to understand where racism begins so we can figure out how to break the cycle and create an equal society.
To piggyback off what Parsa said, something called epistemic injustice can result from discrimination. This is when people are treated unequally by having their ability to comprehend and communicate knowledge undermined. An example of this would be if I thought a classmate could never understand a section of our curriculum because they are naturally incapable of doing so due to their race or background. Epistemic injustice can happen unintentionally. The person committing the act doesn't have to know that they are doing it.
This is why racism needs to be addressed. Many people don't realize that they're hurting others with their thoughts and actions. There's also the problem that people are thinking that racism doesn't exist in Canada or doesn't need to be addressed here because we're better than the United States. This is a classic example of whataboutism. We as Canadians try to shift focus onto America's issues instead of dealing with the very real ones that are right here in Canada.
Yeah, racism very much still exists in Canada. In fact, our Saskatchewan has one of the highest levels of racism and rate of racist incidents in the country, second only to Manitoba, according to the polls conducted by Global News. This isn't a new problem for us either. Historically, the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group, once flourished in this province with over 25,000 active members during the 1920s. There was even an attempted revival of the organization in the 70s.
And right now, racism in Saskatchewan is still a real issue. Most often, it's directed at immigrants or Indigenous people. Immigrants usually don't have access to the same amount of resources as the average person due to language barriers, while Indigenous people are dealing with cultural genocide and intergenerational trauma. Racism just adds another barrier to these people to fight through in order to get along with us in our society. In order to put some of this stuff into perspective, we're going to dissect an example of racism in Saskatoon. This is going to go through CCTV's Laura Woodland's interview with Marvin Ankra, who has been born in Ghana. The interview goes through Marvin's experience with racially motivated, discriminatory comments and incidents in Saskatoon, despite having lived here for 7 years.
He speaks out about receiving differential treatment when trying to enter a bank by getting asked to use a different door, while a white woman going the same way was allowed to enter through the main doors.
Ankara is also highly concerned about the treatment his 7-year-old son receives at school during lunch, where students mock his traditional food. As a father, Ankar is worried, but continues to remind his son that he's perfectly normal and there's nothing wrong with him.
Ankara also describes some of his own experiences while walking down the streets of Saskatoon, where he has gotten questioned about where he came from, and people have directed highly offensive racial slurs toward him, such as telling him to go back to Africa and calling him the N-word.
Ankar's main passage to the media and to the people is to fully accept that racism is alive and present in Canada, and that we can't solve a problem which we refuse to accept exists in the first place. Another event revealing racism in Saskatoon took place on February 2021 in May's Kitchen Vietnamese cuisine.
This incident began when a customer refused to wear a mask and was asked by the staff to follow the proper health and safety guidelines given by the government and wear the mask. The customer proceeded to yell racial slurs at the predominantly Asian staff, all while accusing them of bringing the coronavirus to Canada and telling them to go back to China.
Although, as a result of the incident, the restaurant received a lot of love from the community, as well as their mayor, Charlie Clark. It's unacceptable to let such racially charged acts continue. Situations like these deserve a lot more media recognition, especially since the Asian community has been the biggest target of blame for the pandemic since it began to affect the world at a global scale.
The act of racism has even started to creep into online meetings and events. During February 2021, there was a case of hacking onto a Zoom during an online ceremony. This Zoom was conducted by Muslim students at the U of S, University of Saskatchewan, on the 4th anniversary of the Quebec mosque shooting.
During the ceremony, one of the hackers told the speakers to shut up when talking about the victim of the shooting, while the other person yelled that all the Muslims shall die, and the third person praised Hitler. They also drew a swastika on the screen before getting blocked from the meeting.
This event, just like the others mentioned earlier, is unacceptable considering it's 2021, where it's against the law to threaten somebody of any race and socially and morally unacceptable to do so in the first place. But, as Ankara mentioned, it is essential to first accept that these racist incidents still take place, right here in Saskatoon, before we even begin to stop racism from occurring at all.
One of our United Platform members even experienced indirect racism upon first moving to Saskatchewan from the United States. They were told by locals about the quote-unquote Indian people that lived here, referring to our Aboriginal people. Our member was told that they lived off the government's money free of charge and that they were all drug addicts and alcoholics who would attack you on the street. In another instance, one of our members was told about how useless and boring it was to learn about our native people in history class. Of course, these allegations were all false, but this is just another example of how racism is active in Saskatchewan.
The Global Gathering Place is an organization whose goal is to help refugees and immigrants integrate and thrive in Canada. They started their organization in 1998 and have since helped thousands of newcomers through support such as teaching English, helping with language interpretation in the healthcare system, teaching skills that may be new to them such as using household appliances, and helping with finding employment and making social connections.
The Global Gathering Place also tries to combat racism. A recent example of this is an interactive skill-building session called Train Against Racism, where they held last September. The session was to help people better equipped when engaging in cross-cultural relationships and understanding cultures respectfully. Another way that they've tried to combat racism is by participating in a YCAN video that many residents of Saskatoon received, the QR code for distributed door hangers. Many of our United Platform members helped out with this project.
If you want to learn more about the Global Gathering Place or want to help out the organization, you can visit them at their website at globalgatheringplace.com.
In conclusion, the information portrayed in this podcast is provided in order to shine a light on racism alive in our community. Racism is not an issue of the past, but the present, and the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we can educate our citizens and combat it.
We hope you enjoyed this first installment of our podcast and learned a thing or two. We thank you for listening.
This has been the United Platform Podcast. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next episode. This has been Parsa.